Hello, I'm Scott Allen Jarrett, Music Director of Boston's Back Bay Chorale. It's my pleasure to say hello to you today and to tell you a little bit about our upcoming performance of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. Despite all of the snow and the weather, chorale members have been hard at work preparing Beethoven's great masterpiece. The performance is Saturday, March 21st at Sanders Theater in Harvard Square, and we're joined by four fabulous soloists: Jessica Muirhead, soprano; Adriana Zabala, mezzo-soprano; Stefan Barner, tenor; and of course David Kravitz, singing bass. Today I'm at the Boston Conservatory spending a little time in the library with my friend and colleague and the chorale's program annotator, Dr. Andrew Shryock, who's made available the facsimile of Beethoven's sketchbook for the Missa Solemnis. And we've been trying to decipher the scratches and marks on the page for the Benedictus, and you can see it here behind me. We also had a chance to talk a little bit about the piece and about the challenges and what makes it so important for us to hear and perform today. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shryock to a conversation about Missa Solemnis in preparation for our upcoming performance on March 21st with the Back Bay Chorale. Andrew, I wonder if you just start, why did Beethoven write this Mass? Why a Missa Solemnis? What makes it Solemnis? And why at this point in his life?
Sure. So it's 1819, right? And Beethoven is toward the end of his life, and he's beginning to think about compositional projects that really represent the culmination of his compositional activity up to this point. And so we begin to see these grand compositions around this time. He begins thinking about the Ninth Symphony, which is, of course, grand in the respect that it adds a chorus. He's composing during this time the Diabelli variations. He's composing the Hammerklavier Sonata. And so in spring of 1819, he's presented with the opportunity to compose a Mass. It's a friend and music student, Archduke Rudolph, who is appointed Archbishop, which leads to this potential opportunity. He's appointed Archbishop in the spring, and Beethoven decides that this is the opportunity for the installation, which will take place 1 year later, to compose a new Mass. It is, of course, not his first Mass. Earlier in his career, in 1807, he composes the Mass in C. This is Opus 86. But this is to be a more consummate, a more comprehensive encounter with the genre. And so Beethoven really pours his entire spirit into the composition. In his conversation books, you can see he's interested in thinking about other Mass compositions, the tradition of Mass composition. And of course, what happens as a result is that he completely misses the deadline. The year comes and goes, and Beethoven has made very little progress on this grand project. In fact, he misses, characteristically for Beethoven at this point of his life, he misses the deadline by several years. And so it's 1822 before Beethoven really has a complete draft of the Mass, but it's still in draft stage. And so in early 1823, he begins to introduce revisions. And it's only in early 1824 that the work is really ready for performance.
So one of the things that has always struck me about Missa Solemnis is its vast scope and proportion. And you've spoken to us about the pre-existing models that Beethoven was thinking about and aware of from Mozart and Haydn for sure, but even perhaps Bach and Handel, and perhaps earlier models of Josquin, even awareness of these masses. But we know from the pictures of Beethoven, and we know from our inherited sort of mythology about who Beethoven is, the romantic composer, completely possessed of a musical idea. And it seems to me that this Mass really breaks the mold of any of those models that he might have known about or was working with. I wonder if you would talk about that image of Beethoven and how this piece in some way breaks that mold.
Sure, absolutely. And I think the place is to begin quite literally with an image of Beethoven. He starts the composition of the Missa Solemnis in 1819. In 1820, a year later, he has a portrait done by a fellow. His name is Joseph Karl Stieler. and Stille is a portraitist, and he comes and paints a picture of Beethoven, and you see the composer in the way that we normally think of the composer, the hair wild, the physical appearance unkempt, and yet in his arms he cradles the Missa Solemnis, which is of course striking because the work hasn't even been finished yet, and here he is holding it in score. And so we really see in that moment, and in the compositions themselves, in their scale, in their scope, in their dimensions, in their enormous performing forces, in the way that they transgress the genres in which they're written, we really see Beethoven thinking about his own legacy. And we really, what's very interesting to me, we see him creating a mythology around his own persona.
Let's talk about the music now. The Agnus Dei, the last movement of the Mass, has some peculiar instrumentation. It starts with peculiar voicing in the chorus, and then there are sort of outbursts. And I wonder if you'd sort of give us a roadmap of what Beethoven's working out in this movement.
Yeah, absolutely. The Agnus Dei is, I think, my favorite movement. And the reason is actually right at the end of the movement. There's a moment where the voices fall silent, and there's an orchestral interjection at this place. But the orchestral interjection is striking, because what you have at that moment is the introduction of percussion and brass, timpani and trumpets, playing a highly aggressive, highly rhythmic motive. And it's clearly meant to evoke the sound of military force, human military force. And to understand and appreciate that effect most fully, I think what we need to do is actually look back to the previous movement, to the Sanctus and Benedictus. And we have a similar moment in the Benedictus where the voices fall silent. There's an orchestral interjection at this point as well. And what we have at that place is a sort of foundation of strings which accompany a solo violin and paired flutes. The flutes and the violins enter at that moment at the height of their range, the very extreme height of their range, and descend by step. And the image that is evoked there is very clear. This is a moment where the Savior descends from heaven to take up his role on earth. And so at the end of the Agnus Dei, we get hints of that moment once again, immediately following that military interjection, so that we have a juxtaposition of military force, human military force, and salvation from above, divine salvation. And this creates an incredible tension at the end of the piece. And for many listeners, this tension is left unresolved.
The Et Vitam Venturi. This is the movement that scares choristers and has them, running to all kinds of resources to learn the music. And it's a really terrifying couple of pages because of its difficulty. Its tessitura is really demanding. It's rhythmically very difficult to just get off the page and in the voice. And then that's all combined with just a frantic pace. And it starts slow and almost a stodgy rhythm, but then on a dime,
the second half of the fugue, twice the speed, yeah.
And for all of its marvel as a contrapuntal achievement, there are few things more exciting in the repertoire than this moment.
Yeah, your singers can take solace. Beethoven also struggled over this movement. The Missa Solemnis took 4 years to compose, we know that. The sketches for the Missa Solemnis number almost 1,000 pages. There are almost 800 pages of sketches for this work. For the Credo movement, in which the Et Vitam Venturi fugue appears, there are roughly 200 pages of sketches, and many of these are concerned with precisely this moment, with the fugue that concludes the movement. And what we find at the end of the movement is, as you say, this dense counterpoint, this unrelenting rhythmic activity. And Beethoven struggled with this. There's a wonderful story by an early Beethoven biographer. His name is Anton Schindler. And in Schindler's biography, he chronicles a moment in which he comes to Beethoven's house. And he finds the house in disarray. The housemaids have left, and the composer has locked himself in a room. Schindler's standing on the outside of the door, and he hears what he says, and I quote, stamping and howling, and fragments of the Et Vitam Venturi fugue. He describes the moment as if Beethoven is wrestling out the fugue from the Almighty. Beethoven is wrestling with the gods, trying to get this fugue exactly right. And just as Schindler's about to leave, Beethoven opens the door, and once again we see Beethoven in his traditional appearance. The hair wild, physically unkempt, but the music has been born.
We stomp and howl each Monday night in our own preparations of the piece and are better for it.
You're in good company.
I always find with Beethoven's music, he writes music for performers, singers, and players that really defy abilities. And he, in a sense, he's writing a music and a style that we can't do on our own, but he knows that we can do together. And to me, that's one of the thrilling things about Beethoven, is that he creates a means by which for all of us as musicians to come together to submit our talents, individual and disparate, but achieve something really quite miraculous. Our performance is coming up on March 21st at 8 p.m. at Sanders Theater. We have wonderful soloists, and of course the Back Bay Chorale and our wonderful orchestra. Thank you, Dr. Shryock.
My great pleasure.
Time, and look forward to seeing you in March.